Hello chess fans, in today's video we're going to have a look at a very exciting game which was played at the Chennai Masters. A very strong new super tournament with 8 elite players participating. And in round 1 we have the matchup between 2 gold medalists from the Indian team, Vidit and Erigaisi. And especially for Erigaisi, it's a very special game as he's playing with the black pieces. He's rated 27.99 and if he wins the game, he can break into the 2800 club and who knows, maybe he can even become the new world's number 2. We will see first the game and then I will tell you more about it. Here we go. Vidit opens with 1 e4. Erigaisi playing c5, the Sicilian. Knight f3, e6. And here, interesting move. Instead of playing the open variation with the move d4, Vidit played here the move c4. Knight c6 and only now he goes for the move d4. C takes d4, knight takes d4, and we have a very special variation of the Sicilian Taimanov as white is opting here for the Maroczy bind hedgehog type of structure. Knight f6, knight c3, and this is actually a very well-known position which has even been played a number of times by Magnus Carlsen. The main move here for black is to develop the bishop to b4. It's the most active continuation. But Erigaisi goes here for bishop c5. He's attacking with the bishop and the knight on d4. White is dropping back with the knight to b3, attacking the bishop goes to b4. So black is threatening now to take the pawn on b4 as the knight on c3 is pinned. Bishop d3, protecting the pawn on e4, castle kingside, and so does white. And here black decides to give up the dark squared bishop to ruin white's structure. But these double pawns, are they really weak, or is the white bishop from c1 able to take advantage of the weakened dark squares? That's the big question here. Well, black has different ways of playing. I believe the principled continuation would be to play d5 to open up the position. If pawns are getting exchanged, black is going to take back and then the bishop from c8 will be freed and it can just be developed to an active square. But Erigaisi played the move d6. Now the bishop comes to a3. So you see that the bishop on a3, together with major pieces on the d-file, can definitely exert pressure against that pawn on d6. Rook e8, getting out of that diagonal, rook e1, queen c7, and now the knight comes to d4. And the knight is planning to come to b5, to hit the queen, to hit the pawn on d6 as well. And of course, black is not interested in taking on d4. That would improve white's pawn structure. Therefore, black played here the move a6. But now white's gonna take on c6. The knights are coming off the board. And a lot of interesting ideas. But the move played in the game by Vidit is very understandable. He drops back with the bishop to c2 to clear the d-file and hit the pawn on d6. However, black can take the pawn on c4. White takes on d6. And now the pawn on c3 can be taken. But apparently there's a reason why Erigaisi doesn't want to do that. He decides here to play the move e5 and only now, after bishop to b3, attacking the queen, black takes the pawn on c3. White's the pawn down, but look at that piece activity. This bishop looks great, rook comes to c1, and there are even ideas that after the queen goes away, that the rook can come in to c7 and hit the pawn on f7. But the queen goes back to a5. So now after the move bishop to b4, attacking the queen goes back to d8. Now the queens are coming off the board and the rook comes in to c7. And here you see that black is having a difficult time dealing with that pawn on f7. Rook d7 played. And of course you don't really want to exchange rooks here, but rather bring the other rook into the game, threatening to take the bishop on c8. Rook takes rook, and the threat against the pawn on f7 has been renewed. Therefore, bishop comes to e6. The light squared bishops are coming off the board, but you see that the pawn structure does look quite ugly. And, well, you're pawn down, and of course you can take the pawn on b7, but then the pawn on e4 will be taken, so that's not attractive. Instead, Vidit played a much better move, f3. So this pawn structure looks very nice. The knight on f6 can barely move. And white now is intending to take on b7. So the pawn goes to b5. And this is a critical moment in this queenless middle game, or should I call it an endgame already, in fact. As I said, you are a pawn down as white. But there are clear ideas For instance, to attack the pawn on e5 with your bishop. Bishop may come to c3, and then you hit the pawn. That pawn can be regained very, very soon. I also like ideas just to grab space with h4 and maybe launch a g-pawn as well, so you can bring up these pawns. However, the move played by Vidit, it's something I don't really like. He played here a3, and apparently he's trying to neutralize black's majority. But after a5, bishop c3, black can just aim for simplifications by giving back the pawn, so that after b4, the pawns are coming off the board. You take on b4, and now play looks like pretty simple. With only pawns on the king side, looks like it's going to be a draw. But here, it's clear that only white is pressing. These pawns, they are targets for the rook and for the bishop. But the main point of black's play is now that the rook can start giving checks. Rook a1, king f2, rook a2. If the king goes to g3, there's knight h5. And you do get some problems with your pawns on the second rank. The knight can come to f4. So instead of going to g3, king goes back to f1. Rook a1, king f2, rook a2, king f1, rook a1. Repetition or not? No way. White keeps the game going here with bishop to e1. It's not ideal, but you do have a structural advantage. That's why white is playing on here. Knight h5 played, so the knight is looking for ways to come in. Knight f4, knight d3, attacking that bishop which is pinned. So g3 keeping the knight out from the f4 square. And I would say that something like rook a2 looks quite sensible. To cut off the king along that second rank. And you can, after something like bishop f2, you can play g5 to intend to follow it up with g4 and knight f6. Generating counterplay against these pawns. And well, it looks pretty okay for black. But Erigaisi has a very defensive approach here. He wants to play it very solidly with knight f6, knight is coming back, rook e7, attacking the pawn, rook a3, counter-attacking the pawn on f3, king e2, rook a6, the rook is back defending that pawn on e6, bishop c3, now the pawn on e5 is in trouble, king f8, attacking the rook is forced to leave, and now you can give checks again, rook a2, bishop b2, knight d7, and of course here black is aiming for simplifications. Would really welcome here the exchange of minor pieces. That would be absolutely fine, of course. But white wants to keep that very powerful bishop on the board. King e3, king e8. And now h4. White is grabbing more space with these pawns. So the game is far from over yet. Rook a5, rook c7, g6, g4, h5. Once again, black wants to liquidate, get more pawns off the board. That would definitely help him, but white is playing here g5, excellent move, fixing another weakness on g6. It's not under an attack yet, but you can imagine when the rook comes in, that pawn on g6 becomes a serious problem. Rook a8, rook defends the back rank, rook c6, attacking the pawn, king f7, king d3. Look at this king, the king is coming over via the other side, trying to penetrate into black's position. Rook b8, attacking the bishop, king defends the bishop, rook a8, rook c7, pinning the knight, king e8, rook c6, repetition, no way, the king comes closer, king c3, rook b8, bishop a3. Bishop is looking great here on this diagonal, taking away more squares from the black king. Rook b1, you may follow up here with something like king c4, but first rook c7 played. King e8, rook c8, repetition, once again, but here the rook comes to d8, attacking the knight. Knight goes to b6, and then it's rook f8, king g7, and here we have a big moment in the game as Vidit went here for the move rook f6. He is attacking the pawn on e6, but there's a very instructive line, which I want to show you. You can attack the pawn on e6 from a different angle, with rook e8 attacking the pawn. If you look for this counterattack with rook f1, because it's very difficult to keep that pawn defended. Now you don't take on e6, there's rook takes f3, and black is quite active. But the trick here is to bring the bishop to d6, to hit this weakness. If you do take on f3, the king comes to b4. And you see that the pawn on f3 is not important at all. Black is a pawn up, but doesn't have a passed pawn himself. So the extra pawn on the e-file is useless. And look at that knight on b6. Doesn't have any good squares to go. And for instance, if you go rook e3, there's the following line, king b5, attacking the knight. If you defend it with a rook check, bishop b4, this knight all of a sudden is just trapped. If you go king f7, you can give another check, force the king to go back again, and then rook b8. This knight is just trapped, cannot go anywhere. If you go knight d7, there is rook b7, winning the knight as after rook d3, king c6. You cannot support that knight any longer. Now it's a long line. It is difficult to calculate all of this, but it shows you that in this position, black is having big trouble keeping all the weaknesses defended. And the weaknesses are not only the pawns, it's also the knight on b6, which doesn't have a nice outpost. It cannot count on the support of any of its pawns. Well, let's see what happened. Rook f6, knight a4, check, king c4, knight b6, king c3, knight a4, repetition, no way, king c2, hitting the rook again. Rook b6, defending the pawn, bishop f8, the bishop comes in, king h7, and the bishop is going on an adventure, bishop h6, remarkable maneuver. The knight is out of play, but there are ideas with rook f7 coming soon. Rook b2 check, king d3, rook b7 back again. Don't take the pawn on e6. There is knight c5. The pawn is indirectly defended thanks to this knight fork. Bishop f8 was played, covering the c5 square. Knight b2, king e2 back, rook b6, defending the pawn. Bishop h6 again, rook c6, rook f7, king h8, rook f8, repetition again. But what should white do here? Well, not that simple. Maybe try to play against that knight on b2, but there follow this move, rook g7. White is trying to win that pawn on g6 eventually. Rook c2 check, king e3, rook c3, king d2. Rook takes pawn, and now it's white who finally wins the pawn on g6, and it looks like significant progress. Like you may take on e6, the pawn on e5 can become weak. And well, that's exactly what's going to happen. Knight c4 check. If the king goes to the center, there's rook e3 check and the pawn on e4 is gone. So that's not a good square for the king. King d1 played. And now rook f4. Black is trying to hit two other pawns and aim for further simplifications. But now, the less pieces on the board, the more exciting it gets. Rook takes pawn. And what should black do here? Well, Erigaisi, fantastic calculator, came up with a very important resource. It's important to realize that you cannot take the pawn on e4. It does run into the move g6 with a mating threat on e8. And if you try to come back with rook d4 check, moving the king and go back to d8, there is rook f6. And after, let's say, king g7, you go g7 and there's nothing you can do against rook f8. And if rooks are coming off the board, white is getting a new queen. So don't take the pawn, but look at this. Knight e3, fantastic defensive move. Check. King d2. Knight comes in to g4 so that white is not able to push the pawn as the bishop will be hanging. Also, the knight is defending the pawn on e5. King d3, king g8, rook e8 check, king h7. Of course, you're pawn down as black, but white is having a difficult time to make progress. A number of checks again, and look at this. The bishop now is not ideally placed on h6. It goes to the other side again. Knight f2 check, king c4, rook takes e4 check, king d5. The king is walking in. White is sacrificing his remaining pawns. Rook takes h4. All of a sudden it's black who is a pawn up now. But white has a clear plan in mind with bishop to e7. Defending the pawn. After rook g4, the king goes to e6. And this king is a very important attacker. If you're playing careless here with black and you move your pawn from h5 to h4, then you put the bishop on f6. And all of a sudden, this king is caught in a mating net. If you go king g6, for instance, you can give a check. If the king goes back, you give another check. King g6, rook h6 is checkmate. Here you see how important king's activity is in positions with not too many pieces left on the board. Now let's go back. Instead of h4, Erigaisi went here for the move knight e4, attacking the pawn on g5. And if you do the same, bishop f6, well, there's knight takes g5, and you're holding on here as black. If king f5, there's knight f7, the rook is defended, the knight is covering this square, you're threatening to give a check. I mean, black is out of the woods. But let's see what happened. There followed here the move king f5. And here you're defending the pawn. Everything is under control still for white. But knight g3. And what are you going to do? I mean, you can go back and repeat the moves. That's okay. Then the game will end in the draw. But Vidit wants to play for a win here. And he captured the pawn on e5. But now all of a sudden there is this absolutely amazing defensive resource with the move king g6. And now it's white who has to be very careful, as the big threat is to go here for the move king f7. And in that case, the rook is hanging. The rook also got to keep the bishop defended. And you cannot do much against it. If you move the rook away, there are always ideas with rook e4 and knight f5. Then you can win the bishop. The same, of course, if the bishop moves, there's rook e4 and the rook on e8 is hanging. If you go rook g8 check, king f7, the problem is still not solved. Therefore, white played here king e6. But the king is not going anywhere. There's rook e4 check. King has to go somewhere. If you go king d5, there's king f7. And white is going to lose his bishop. Instead, they follow the move king d7. But now it's knight f5. And here, white can no longer avoid the exchange of rooks. Or a liquidation into a king and pawn endgame when the h-pawn is just out of reach. Rook g8, by the way, once again, king f7. You cannot save the rook. This looks like it's going to be winning here for black. Actually, maybe it's better to go king h7. I realize now, as after king f7 there is perhaps still rook f8, and you're not making too much progress. So king h7 is the right way to go. But anyway, there followed the move bishop to d8, and now there's rook takes e8, king takes e8, and it's all of a sudden an endgame of knight versus bishop, one pawn each. G-pawn is neutralized, black can run. And the pawn is just 3 squares away, and it got to be stopped on the dark square, on the h2 square. King d7, h3, threatening to go h2, bishop c7, only move. King takes pawn, king e6, king g4. Now the threat is that if, let's say you play king d5, you go knight g3, interfering on that diagonal, and the h-pawn can no longer be stopped. White played here, the move bishop h2, knight g3 anyway, good move. King f6, and after king f3, white resigned. The king is coming to g2. For instance, if you go king g5, it's king g2. The bishop cannot stay on the diagonal. If it goes to g1, it will just be taken. So that doesn't work. If you take on g3, king takes g3, the pawn will queen. And of course, 2800 plus player can win with queen and king only. That means that Erigaisi is moving from 27.99 to 28.03. It's absolutely amazing. He's world's number 3 now. He's only 2 points behind Fabiano Caruana, and I think about 28 points behind Magnus Carlsen. It's not realistic. He's gonna leapfrog Magnus Carlsen this tournament. But one more victory for him will mean that he will become the new world's number 2. And that's very important news for him, as he's also trying to qualify for the candidates tournament. And you can do that by rating. I don't know the exact regulations for that. But definitely rating points do really matter to these guys. I have to say, Vidit was very close in beating his fellow countryman. But Erigaisi, he's such a trickster. Fantastic defensive resources were found by him. I'm very impressed with his play. I hope you did like watching this video. Thanks for doing that. Once again, apologies for having this small break. I had some throat issues, suffering from a flu, but I'm back again. And I will cover many, many more exciting games from this tournament. And of course, also there's much more exciting chess this month, including the start of the World Championship match between Ding Liren and Gukesh. So stay tuned for more action on this channel.